Okay. As Hashem, today's daf is Masechta Menachos Daf Nun Zayin. And we will start from very easy, simple, straightforward Gemara on Daf Nun Vava Medbeis, 4 lines from the bottom. So Amar Rab Ami. We learned, of course, you learned in the Mishnah and we learned in the Chumash, you're not allowed to make sure that when you make a mincha, it's not allowed to be chametz. It's so important, and the kahanim, the ones that are making these minchas, they have to be very, very careful. So what happens? Amar Rabani, and what's interesting also, and another interesting thing is we learned that even if you made the mincha chametz, let's say you made it chametz like in the picture over here, and then you go ahead and make it, and then set it up, and you set it up into little pieces like matzah pieces, and then bake it. You chayiv for every step of the way, even if you chayiv another malchus for every action that you're doing while the mincha is chametz. That's called mechametz acha mechametz. That it's although it's chametz, you could still be chayiv because you're doing another action within the mincha that while it's chametz. Amar Rabami said, Haniach Sa'ar al Gabi Isaf. One places a Sa'ar. A Sa'ar is a piece of yeast, let's say, on top of a dough, on top of the mincha. You didn't do anything. You didn't make it chametz by adding water or stuff like that. And you sat on the side, and it became chametz, may allow by itself. Let's say one side of the pan became chametz. Chayev alei chayev, kamasa Shabbos, like the actions that one would do on Shabbos. So on Shabbos, you could put, as you can see in the picture, you could put a piece of steak, a raw piece of meat on top of coals and walk away, and you chayev because of bishul. So therefore you don't have to actively do something to make it chametz just by dropping in a piece of yeast into the flour mixing. If you make it chametz, you chayev malchus. Says the Gemara, Ma'aseh Shabbos ki haygavedim yimechayev. Are you going to be chayev on Shabbos when you put a piece of meat on top of coals? Amar Rabba Babachana, we go to Amar Aleph. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, hiniach basa, we go to Amar Aleph. Hiniach basa al gabe chon. If you put a piece of meat on top of coals, right? You put a piece of meat on top of a coals, so you're not chayev. Hipich boy, but if you turned it over, you flipped it over, then you flipped it over, as you can see. So then chayev. Lo hipich boy, but if you didn't flip it over, potter, you're potter. So, but you do see that you have to do some action over here. So by mincha, which you're trying to compare to Shabbos, it should not be enough just to throw the piece of yeast into the mixture. You probably have to do something, just like on Shabbos. In order to be chayev, you have to do something by flipping it over. And says the Gemara, Amar Rava says, my chayev, nami dekama. What do we mean liable? Kemaiset sli shel Shabbos. It's like the action of roasting on Shabbos. The action of roasting on Shabbos, you just put it down on the flame, on the coals. Yes, you have to flip it over, but there's an action of just placing something. So also, when it comes to making something chametz, it's not exactly like Shabbos, but by the mincha, all you have to do is drop a piece of yeast there, and you're chayiv, you get malchus. That's enough. That's enough of an action to get malchus. So let us understand. The Gemara now just tries to understand, what does it mean of Shabbos? I threw something out to you about Shabbos. If you put this on a piece of coal, you're not chayiv unless you flip it over. Why not? Gufo, Amar Rabba Babachon, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. If you put meat on top of coals, hipich boy, if you flip it over, chayiv. Loy hipich boy, if you didn't flip it over, potter. You're potter. Hey Chidami, what's the case? If would be a case that if you wouldn't turn it over, bay loy bishil, it would not get cooked, right? So it needs you to flip it over to if you don't flip it over, it's not going to get cooked. So that's why you have to flip it over. In other words, the question is, if you want to say that it's not going to cook that it's not going to cook. Even if you don't turn it over, it's not going to cook. Fine, but if you're going to say that if you're not going to turn it over, it still would cook. So why aren't you chayev by before flipping it over? In other words, why are you not chayev, like I said before, by just leaving it on the coals? So the Gemara says we're talking about a unique case. If you're not going to turn it over, have a bishul mitzad echad. It would cook on one side, but kamachol ben draisai, like only a little bit, like it would be like the machol of this person called ben draisai, who was a known robber, and there in the time of the Chazal, and he used to cook his food only a third of the way. So if you're not going to flip it over, that side that's touching the coals will be roasted only a third of the way. It's only when you turn it over, then it gets cooked on both sides, like as much as Malcha ben Rasai. So we're dealing with very weak coals over here. The maximum that these coals could cook is only a third, cook a third of the way. That's why you're going to have it cooked on one side a third, and then you flip it over, and that side is cooked a third of the way. And there, only then, if you flip it over, you're chayev. But if you don't flip it over, if you kumash malon, if you don't flip it over, the chol mitzad echad kebachol ben derasai like klubu. If it's cooked only on one side, kebachol ben derasai, not cooked through and through, like klum, that's nothing. So you have to flip them over in order to be chayev. So it's like a unique situation that we're talking about over here. Omar Rava. Rava said, let's say the coals are so weak, let's say, let's make a picture. Let's draw something with a red, okay? Very thick red. Let's say it's enough to make this coals, enough to make a little size of a dried fig, cook. It could cook it through and through the size of a dried fig. Okay, so it's just that. So since it could cook it through and through both sides, albeit a small piece of the steak, then you'll be chayiv. And the chiddush is, of course, it cooked the whole way. That if only cooked a drop, less than the size of a gregris. Let's say it cooked a drop, but each piece is not the size of a gregris, so that you don't combine the little drops. It has to be in one place, the size of a dried fig that was cooked through and through. That's what the Gemara says. Amalei Ravina Ravashi b'mokim echad in, only if it was cooked through and through in one place, only then you will say that Yechayev, Mishnayim or Gimel Makayim loy. But if it was cooked in three different places, you don't combine the little spots together. Says the Gemara of Otanan, but didn't we learn in the Mishnah, not in the area of cooking, that you do combine spots? Because the Mishnah says, HaKodeach kol shehu chayev. If you make little holes in the wall, tiny holes in a wall, okay? Let's go with tiny holes in a wall. Imagine this is tiny holes. So tiny holes in a wall. So the Mishnah says, then you're liable. Hey chidami, what's the case? If you made a tiny hole in one place, kolshu l'may chazi. If it's so small, a tiny hole, what could you use it for? Elalav bishnayim ashloishim mekaymis. You made it in 2 or 3 places. The chazir and tzirif, because it's enough holes that if you combine them, they would become one big hole, right? If you combine them, they would become one big hole, like if you combine them. So we view it as one big hole, and it's usable to do something, to stick something in there. So that's what the Gemara's question is. So we see that you do combine things. So the question is, how come when it comes to the piece of meat, you don't combine little spots? Answers the Gemara, loy. That Mishnah is not talking about combining tiny holes in a wall. You made one tiny hole. And your question was, what could you do with a tiny hole? The chaze levava daklida. It's for the point of an ancient key. You see, if you made just one tiny hole, what could you use it for? You see, these are ancient keys. And you could be able to, the point of the ancient key could go, wedge its way into the tiny hole, into one of the tiny holes. So if it could wedge its way into a tiny hole, so it's useful for something, you did something, and that's why you're chayav. So really, we don't combine little things. And others viewed it. Rava says the opposite. Even if you burnt the steak, you made the steak in a few places, in small different places, we will combine the little parts that you cooked into one piece. So the Gemara asks the opposite. Amalei Ravina Ravashi, isn't that a perfect raya? The Mishnah says that if you just do one little hole, you're chayev. You're doing a tiny hole, you're chayev. You make a tiny hole in the wall, as I showed you before. Hey chidami, if you made one place, what could you do with a tiny hole? Elalav, it must be b'shnayim u'shleishim hakaimis. You made a hole in 2 or 3 places, the chazi litzirav, that you could combine. So you see this concept in Hilchas Shabbos that you combine tiny things to make one isser. So same thing. If you cooked a piece of steak, in tiny places, right? Through and through, of course. So even though not one of them is the size of a groigris, but you combine it, and that's how you chayev, and that's what Rava said. So the Gemara says, Loi, it's not a proof from the Mishnah that the Mishnah agrees to the Rava. Really, the Mishnah is discussing you made one tiny hole, and you're not combining anything. And you ask the question, what could you use it for? I could use it for just wedge the tip of a key. An ancient key could be wedged there, like it could hold a key up. So therefore, it's even one tiny hole. It has usage to it. That's why you're chayiv in that Mishnah. Now we go back to we just digressed to Hilchas Shabbos. Now we go back to brand new Gemara in talking about making a mincha chametz. We're back to the Gemara. Tana Rabbanan. Rabbanan said, "Ilu nema asher tekrivu l'Hashem lo yiseyafa chametz." If it says the pasuk says lo yiseyafa chametz asher takrivu l'Hashem. First it says don't make chametz. What you makrav to the Eibishter. But if it would say the reverse, I would think ainly ela b'lo yisasei chametz ela kaimitz bavad. I would think that only the kaimitz has the isser of not becoming chametz. Asher takrivu l'Hashem, whatever you makrav to the Eibishter, which is the kaimitz. You see the kaimitz. Only this, which you're going to throw on the mizbeach, only that I would think is chayev if you make a chametz. Mincha manayim. How do you know the regular mincha? Talmud loyma mincha. That's why it says mincha. Shar menachos manayim. How do you know by other minchas? Because that was talking about certain minchas marchashes. Talmud loyma kol hamincha shatikrivu kol Talmud loyma kol hamincha asher takrivu l'Hashem k'sheira v'lo pesula. The kan amru hamachmitz es a k'sheira chayev es a pesula pata. What the Gemara just said over here is like this: the rest of the mincha, every mincha, a kol mincha asher takrivu l'Hashem, any mincha, whether it's the shirayim, whether it's the kaimitz, you have an issa to make it chametz. And we darshan something else. Asher takrivu l'Hashem, it has to be a kosher mincha. Let's say you have a mincha that you took it outside the base of Mikdash. Let's say here's the mincha, and before you did the kmitz, or even after, you took it outside the base of Mikdash, or it overnighted in the base of Mikdash, right? So then, is there an issa to make it chametz? Well, it became puzzle already, because once you took it outside the base of Mikdash, it's puzzle. So it's not kosher anymore to bring on the mizbeach. So Makan Amri Hamachmitz is kshera. Only if you make chametz a kosher mincha chayev, then you get the liability of making a mincha chametz. That's a psula. But if it was puzzle already, potter, you're exempt. Once it was puzzled for a different reason, if you make a chametz, you're not chayiv. Says the Gemara, boyer a papa. Papa asked the question, chimtza the yotzes. First you had a kosher mincha, then you made it chametz, so you were liable. You get one avera. The yotzes, and then you took it outside the base of Migdash. The cause of chimtza, and then you, let's say, baked it again, and you made it chametz. So if it was just a kosher mincha, you didn't take it out, so you chayav two lavin, right? Because of making a chametz and then you're baking it. But here you interrupted it by going outside the base of Migdash. Mahu, what's the din? Do you get two malchus or just one? Why don't you say, kiva the yotzes, if so, lay b'yotzeh. As soon as you took it out, this mincha is pasul. When you do make a chametz again by baking it while it's chametz, you won't be liable because you're involved, even though it's chametz, and you're dealing with a mincha that's chametz, but you interrupted it you interrupted the process by going outside, taking the mincha outside the base of Migdash. So you don't get an avera for baking this chametz diga mincha. Ideal, maybe you will get an avera. Kivam the chimtza psul yoytze loy mahani be. Since you made it chametz already, so it was pasul. So what did you gain by taking it outside the base of Migdash? It was already pasul the first time you made it chametz. And now when you're making it again chametz by baking it when it's chametz, then you'll be chayiv because you did chametz after chametz. So the Gemara says, take it. Rav Papa remained unresolved by this question. By Rav Murray asked the question. Let's say you took let's take a look the kaimitz. What do you do with the kaimitz? You walk to the top of the mizbeach, right? Before he dumped it, you see he's dumping the kaimitz on the mizbeach. So before he dumped it, he made this kaimitz chametz. The Torah says, don't make it chametz, but till you get to makriv it on the mizbeach. But here he's already on the mizbeach, but it was prior to him throwing it onto the mizbeach. So that's the question. Boyer Ramari, if you made it chametz on the top of the mizbeach, mahu, what's the dim? Asha takriva marachmana. The Torah says, don't make a mincha chametz until you bring it close to the mizbeach for akrave, and you already brought it close to the mizbeach. Or maybe maybe the fact is that you didn't burn it yet on the mizbeach, so it's like as if you're missing the action of why you brought it to the mizbeach. So therefore, the lav still remains of don't make a chametz. So teku, this remains unresolved. So we have two boyas that remained unresolved. Now the Gemara continues and says like this: Hashta new Gemara. We just told you that every mincha has a avera to make it chametz. So asha takrivu lamali. Why did the Torah says only minchas that you bring on the mizbeach? What is that teaching you? What is that limiting you? In other words, it's trying to tell you that there's some minchas that are not liable if you make it chametz. So what is that? Those mincha. Look at the Tanya, like we learned in the Brisa. Asha ketrivu urabis minchas nechames nesachem lechimis de Rabbi Yosef Glili. Minchas nesachem is a type of mincha that comes along with a carbon. You makrav a carbon, and then you put a whole plate of flour with oil and wine on the mizbeach, right? So that's called minchas that comes along with the pouring of the wine. So there, since there's no kamitza, there's nothing that's separated in takrivu lashem. So there, according to Rabbi Yosef Glili, there's no iser chimutz on that. There's no iser making a chametz. So it wasn't included in the lav of chametz, the minchas nesachem. Rabbi Kiva says, the rabbis lechem aponim chimutz. Rabbi Kiva was the one that said that the lechem aponim, there's an iser to make it chametz. You know, you see in the pictures that the lechem aponim on the table look like thick breads, but really they were matzah. If they did become chametz, since it never ended up on the mizbeach, because it was on Shabbos, it was just taken off the table and split amongst the kahanim. Rabbi Kiva says there's no iser chametz on that lechem aponim bread. So the Gemara analyzes Rabbi Yosef Glili. Rabbi Yosef Glili said minchas nesachem you get is permitted to make it chametz. Something that is made, how could it ever become chametz? Minchas nesachem may perishem. They never used they only used a lot of oil in making minchas nesachem. 3 lugs of oil, right? and into minchas nesachim with no water. And we know if it's just oil in the flour, may Paris ain't machmitzim. The fruit juice cannot be make it chametz. Just having oil in the minchas nesachim will not make it chametz. So of course, there's no isser to make it chametz. It's not possible for it to become chametz. Amar Shlakish said, that the minchas nesachim, they mixed it with water. So if they mixed it with water, according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, they actually mixed the minchas nesachim with water. So therefore, if you do it, it's kashera. You could do it. You don't have to do it, but if you did it, it's still kosher as minchas nesachim. So therefore, there is a possibility for a minchas nesachim to become chametz. If it does become chametz, no problem, according to the shita of Rabbi Yossi, because Rabbi Yossi Aglili, because it's excluded from the pasuk Asher Takrivu Lashem. Now the Gemara asks the question: Lechem upon him midas yavishi, v'shamina le Rabbi Kiva midas yavish loy niskacha. There's a very interesting machlokes. You see, let's take a look over here on the picture. There were two types of kalim in the base of Migdash. One was used, as you can see, as a measuring oil. Let's say this glass, and then there was stuff that was used to measure dry foods. According to Rabbi Akiva, like flour, these things, the measuring cups in the base of Migdash to measure dry foods, never had a din klisharis. It never could be mekadesh anything. So anything that you put in there is not holy. So how could the lechem upon him ever become chametz? It was never holy until after you baked it, and once it's baked, it can never become chametz. That's the Gemara's question. According to Rabbi Akiva, Shamina le Rabbi Akiva, we hold Rabbi Akiva said midas yovich loy miskacha. The measuring cups that measure dried food in the base of Migdash never became holy. If so, the lechem upon him can never become chametz because it wasn't holy lechem upon him until after you baked it, and after you baked it, it's you can't change it into chametz. And says the Gemara, Shalach Rabbi Mishmeid Rabbi Yochanan Kachi Yatzal Shemishin Be'epa. You're right. The what you heard, that was correct. The visions, the opinions that you heard in the Mishnah, that's true, but you have to turn it around. And it's not like Rabbi Kiva was saying lo rabbis lechem upon him. It's Rabbi Yossi Aglili that said that. Asha takrivu lo rabbis lechem upon him lechimus. Divrei Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Rabbi Kiva was the one that says lo rabbis minchas nesachem lechimus. Rabbi Kiva, you're right. Rabbi Kiva was marba minchas nesachem for chimus, and according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, you include lechem upon him. For Ozder Rabbi Yochanan Tamei. Rabbi Yochanan goes according to his reasoning. Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yossi Aglili, the Echad mitalmidei Rabbi Shmuel Amru Davar Echad. Rabbi Yossi Aglili, and one of the students of Rabbi Shmuel said this. They held the same thing. Umani Rabbi Yoshia. That means they're going to hold like this. The Tanya we learned in a brayso. Vayim shachein vayikadesh oisab. It says that Moshe Rabbeinu anointed all the kalim of the Mishkan and made them holy. Them holy. Oisam. Only them. So something is excluded. Rabbi Yoshia says, Midas halach nimshach bein b'fnim bein b'chutz. Measuring cups had the anointment on the inside and the outside. So the measuring cups, according to Rabbi Yossi, the liquid ones had anointment on the inside and the outside. The dry ones had just an anointment on the inside, but not the outside. But it was still anointing. So therefore, midas hayalvesh nimshechu mibefnim ve'ein nimshechu mibechutz. That had was made holy on the inside, but not on the outside. Therefore, according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, the lechem upon him, which was put into a dry measuring cup to measure the flour, became holy as soon as you put it in. And therefore, I would have thought that there's an isser to that you have to be careful it doesn't become chametz. So Rabbi Yossi says that's what the pasuk is teaching you, that lechem upon him is exempt from the isser of becoming chametz. That was the opinion of Rabbi Yossi Aglili, who aligns himself with the opinion of Rabbi Yashia that the dry measuring cups were holy. But Rabbi Yonason says, Midas lach nimshechu b'fnim, ve'ein nimshechu b'chutz. The liquid measuring cups did have was holy on the inside and not on the outside. Midas hayavesh lo nimshechu kol ikar, and a dry measuring cup never had any holiness to it. And Rabbi Yonason said, I'll prove it to you. Sharei mekatches, because the dry measuring cups never made anything holy. The ksiv, because the pasuk says, "V'moisho yisichem toviu lechem tenufa shnayim shnei mesrim soelis tiena tometz tiafana bikurim lashem." The Torah tells you about those two massive breads that you break on Shavuos, and it's chametz. And the Torah tells you that only after you bake it they become holy. Why did they become holy when you measure the flour? When you measure the flour prior to that, it must be that the dry cups were never holy. The dry measuring cups were never holy. Amos say, "Hey Lashem, la'achash nefu," only after you bake it. My kamifligi, what are they arguing? What are they arguing? Ba'oisam. The Torah tells you that Moshe made measuring cups holy. Rabbi Yashi says, "Oisam lemute midas yavesh v'bechutz." Oisam is only excluding that the dry measuring cups were not holy on the outside, but they were holy on the inside. Rabbi Yonason Savar midas yavesh chali. All measuring cups, all dry measuring food cups are in the base of in the Mishkan were non-holy. But the Torah was excluded. And I don't need the pasuk to remind that. The Torah was only excluding that the liquid measuring cups, they only got their holiness on the inside, but not on the outside. But dry measuring cups were never, ever holy. Says the Gemara. So one question, Lema Nami, let us say also, Rabbi Kiva, Tami Rabbi Shmuel, Amri Dava Echad. Doesn't Rabbi Kiva agree with Rabbi Yonason? Because they both hold that the measuring cups, the dry measuring cups, never became holy. And why are we only saying that Rabbi Yosef Galili aligns with Rabbi Yeshia, but Rabbi Kiva does not fully align with Rabbi Yonason? Answers the Gemara, because when it comes to the wet measuring cups, the liquid measuring cups, Rabbi Kiva is of the opinion they were totally holy on the inside and the outside, and Rabbi Yonason holds no, only on the inside the liquid measuring cups were holy, but not on the outside. Concludes the Gemara. How could you say that the lechem upon him never became holy? When you're kneading something, aren't you using a bowl and a liquid bowl and when you're kneading it, that's how it becomes holy, because you're going to end up using a liquid bowl anyway. Amalei, so Abaya said, so it's talking about that they used a leather, flat plate that wasn't a liquid plate in order to do the kneading for the lechem upon it. Okay, so one last question. How could Rabbi Yonason prove that it wasn't holy until they baked it, until they baked the shtei halechem? Maybe the reason why it wasn't holy is because they didn't use the dry measuring cups of the Beis Hamikdash. Maybe they used the dry measuring cups of somewhere else. But could be that the dry measuring cups of the Beis Hamikdash were holy. So the Gemara says, how can you say that? The Torah doesn't tell you how to knead the dough in the Beis Hamikdash. The Levet Bisa Meishers, they don't tell you use a liquid bowl to knead the dough. So when you're using just a plain piece of leather to knead the dough, less than bar, you didn't do anything wrong. El Isarim, when the Torah tells you measure out the flour for the shtei halechem. Even the Torah tells you measure out an isarin of flour, the kail bay, and measure it. So shavik isarin the kodesh, the kail isarin the kail. Will you not use the one in the base, the holy one in the Beis Hamikdash, and use a measuring cup from your house? Certainly, you will use the one in the Beis Hamikdash. And despite that you're using the one in the Beis Hamikdash, the Torah tells you it doesn't become holy until after it's baked. So we see from there, that's how Rabbi Yonason proved that the dry measuring cups in the Beis Hamikdash were not at all holy. Okay, we'll stop over here.
All right, thank you.